In the late 1930s, Burma stood at the crossroads of empire, a land of teak forests, oil fields, and monsoon-drenched valleys that seemed distant from Europe's gathering storm. Yet beneath the stillness of rice paddies and the rhythm of riverboats on the Irrawaddy, the fault lines of global war were already shifting. Once administered as part of British India, Burma had been separated in 1937 and ruled directly by London. To the British Empire, it was not merely territory, it was a vital artery. Through the port of Rangoon flowed rice, oil, and trade routes connecting India to Malaya and Singapore. But what made Burma indispensable would soon make it a target. And within months, that target would ignite a chain reaction no one in Rangoon could stop. The rising power of Imperial Japan had been watching. Since 1937, Japan had been locked in brutal war with China. As Japanese forces pushed inland, China's survival increasingly depended on foreign aid. That aid traveled along a rugged supply route known as the Burma Road, a lifeline running from Rangoon through the mountains into Yunnan province. American trucks, British fuel, munitions, medicine, all passed through Burma. For Japan's strategists, the equation was simple: sever the road, and China suffocates. So Burma became more than a colony, it became a geopolitical hinge. Britain sought to protect India, the jewel of the empire. Japan sought to isolate China and secure Southeast Asia. China fought to survive. And the United States, though not yet fully committed to war in Asia, watched the corridor closely for power's one narrow land bridge. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the shockwaves did not stop in Hawaii. They rippled across Asia. Within weeks, Japanese forces surged through Thailand, Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies. The myth of European invincibility in Asia evaporated almost overnight. British strongholds that had seemed permanent began to tremble. Burma was next, and when Japanese bombers appeared over Rangoon in December 1941, the illusion of distance vanished. Fire spread across the docks, oil tanks exploded. Civilians fled into the streets. The port that had symbolized imperial order now burned under black smoke. British commanders scrambled to organize defenses, but they were stretched thin. The Middle East had priority. North Africa demanded troops. Burma had been an afterthought, and now it stood alone against a seasoned, battle-hardened enemy moving with terrifying speed. And the decisions made in those frantic days would shape one of the greatest military reversals of the Second World War. The Japanese 15th Army, under Lieutenant General Shojiro Ida, did not plan a slow advance. They intended a fluid strike, infiltration through jungle, rapid flanking maneuvers, and relentless forward motion. Their soldiers were trained for jungle warfare. British and Indian units in Burma were not. Some wore desert uniforms meant for North Africa. Others had barely completed training. Intelligence underestimated Japanese mobility. Commanders believed dense jungle would slow any advance. They were wrong, as Japanese columns pushed across the Thai-Burma border in January 1942. They seemed to dissolve into the terrain itself. They bypassed strong points. They cut roads behind defensive lines. British units that believed themselves secure suddenly found communications severed. Roadblocks appeared where maps showed empty jungle. The enemy was no longer ahead. He was everywhere. Fear spread faster than gunfire. Yet in London and Delhi, the scale of the threat was still misunderstood. Burma was viewed as a secondary theater, a sideshow to Europe. Reinforcements were delayed. Air cover was limited. Supplies were scarce. The defenders faced an adversary who had already shattered Western armies in Malaya and was moving north with confidence. Burma was no longer a crossroads. It was becoming a trap, and as the first defensive lines began to buckle, as Rangoon's fate hung in the balance, one catastrophic decision at a river crossing would transform retreat into disaster and mark the beginning of a humiliation so profound it would take 2 years and tens of thousands of lives to erase. If you're drawn to powerful, deeply researched World War II stories like this, stories that explore not just battles but belief, leadership, and resilience, make sure you subscribe and like this video. It helps more people discover these forgotten turning points of history. Because what happened next in Burma would not simply be a defeat, it would be a collapse. The invasion of Burma began in January 1942, and almost immediately, the British defense began to unravel. Japanese forces did not advance in rigid columns. They flowed through the jungle like water finding cracks in stone. Under Lieutenant General Shojiro Ito, the Japanese 15th Army crossed from Thailand with speed and confidence, striking at weak points and bypassing strongholds. British and Indian units, under strength, undertrained for jungle warfare, and thinly supplied, struggled to understand an enemy who refused to fight the way they expected. What they faced was not just an army, but a doctrine built on movement, surprise, and psychological shock. And within weeks, that shock would shatter an entire front. The defenders of Burma consisted largely of two divisions: the 17th Indian Division, inexperienced and still organizing, and the 1st Burma Division, underprepared and ill-equipped. Many troops had trained for desert warfare. Few understood jungle survival. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, had honed their tactics in China. They infiltrated dense forest, emerged behind Allied lines, and severed supply routes. Roadblocks appeared where none should have existed. Units that believed they were advancing suddenly found themselves encircled. Communications faltered, rumors multiplied, panic began to spread. The first major crisis erupted at the Sitting River in February 1942. The Sitting Bridge was a critical crossing, the only viable route for withdrawing Allied forces. As Japanese pressure mounted, British commanders feared the bridge might fall intact into enemy hands. In a moment of desperation, the order was given to destroy it. Explosives detonated. The bridge collapsed into the river. But thousands of Indian troops were still on the wrong side. Stranded without heavy equipment, cut off from vehicles and artillery, they faced the agonizing choice of attempting a swim across the wide river or abandoning their weapons entirely. Many drowned, others lost rifles and supplies in the current. The destruction of the bridge, intended to slow the Japanese advance, instead crippled British defensive capacity. It was not just a tactical error, it was a psychological blow. And in that instant, confidence within the Burma army fractured. Rangoon fell on March 8, 1942. Its port facilities were destroyed before evacuation, but the loss was devastating. With Rangoon gone, the Burma Road, China's lifeline, was severed. The city's fall triggered chaos. Civilians poured into the countryside. Government offices collapsed into disarray. Allied forces attempted to regroup further north, but the Japanese pressed relentlessly, outflanking positions at Tungu and threatening encirclement after encirclement. Air superiority belonged to Japan. Allied aircraft were few and poorly coordinated. Bombers struck retreating columns and supply depots. Roads clogged with refugees slowed military withdrawal. Soldiers and civilians merged into one endless line of desperation stretching toward India. Then began one of the most harrowing retreats of the Second World War. As Allied forces pulled back toward the Indian frontier, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled alongside them. Anglo-Burmese families, Indian laborers, Chinese traders, all fled northward on foot. The monsoon arrived early. Roads dissolved into mud, food supplies vanished. Cholera and malaria spread through exhausted columns. One refugee, Morgan Jones, would later recount walking nearly 600 miles from Rangoon to Imphal, leaning on a simple walking stick he believed saved his life. Many others never reached India. They died along jungle tracks, buried in shallow graves beside rivers swollen with rain. Meanwhile, Allied troops attempted to establish defensive lines in central Burma, but each stand ended the same way: infiltration, encirclement, collapse. Japanese mobility shattered every attempt at cohesion. British and Indian units withdrew again and again, their morale draining with each mile. By May 1942, the retreat ended not in counterattack, but in exhaustion. Burma was lost. The Japanese had driven the Allies entirely from the country. The campaign had become one of the greatest defeats suffered by British forces in the war against Japan. The empire's aura of strength in Asia lay in ruins, India itself now seemed vulnerable. The once dismissed jungle front had become a glaring wound in Allied strategy. And yet, in that humiliation, something began to stir. Because defeat this complete forces a reckoning. The army that staggered into India in 1942 was broken, but not destroyed. Its officers had seen their failures exposed in brutal clarity. Its soldiers had survived conditions few European armies had ever endured. And in that crucible of collapse, a question emerged that would define the next 2 years. Could an army that had fled 900 miles find the will to turn back? When the shattered remnants of the Burma army crossed into India in May 1942, they carried more than exhaustion, they carried humiliation. The retreat had stretched nearly 900 miles, units had dissolved. Civilians had perished in the tens of thousands, Burma was gone. In London, the campaign was overshadowed by North Africa and the Atlantic. In Asia, it felt like abandonment. But amid the wreckage of defeat, a quiet transformation began, one led by a commander who understood that before territory could be reclaimed, belief had to be restored. And if that belief failed, India itself might be next. The British reorganized their forces into what would become the British 14th Army. At its helm stood Lieutenant General William Slim, a man neither aristocratic nor flamboyant, but intensely practical. Slim grasped what others had missed. The Japanese had not won because they were superhuman. They had won because they adapted to the jungle, and the Allies had not. Slim's first battlefield was not terrain, it was morale. He spoke plainly to his soldiers. He acknowledged past failures without excuse. He rejected the myth of Japanese invincibility. He emphasized training, aggressive patrols, jungle navigation, coordinated artillery. Troops were told not to fear encirclement. If you are surrounded, Slim explained, the enemy is equally surrounded. It was a psychological inversion, a reframing of fear into opportunity. Yet confidence alone would not stop bullets. In late 1942, the Allies attempted a limited offensive in the Arakan region. It ended in disappointment. Japanese defensive bunkers, cleverly concealed with earth and timber, resisted frontal assault. British units faltered again under infiltration tactics. The pattern of retreat threatened to repeat itself. For a moment, it seemed as though reform might prove too little, too late. And had this second failure broken morale once more, the Burma front might have collapsed permanently. But something subtle had changed. The 14th Army did not disintegrate. Instead of despair, Slim demanded analysis. What had gone wrong? Logistics, he concluded, were decisive. In Burma's roadless interior, traditional supply lines were liabilities. Trucks stalled in mud, pack animals perished. The jungle swallowed convoys whole, so the Allies turned to the sky. Air supply, once experimental, became doctrine. Using transport aircraft like the Dakota C-47, entire divisions could be sustained by parachuted rations, ammunition, and medical supplies. Airstrips were carved into jungle clearings. Units learned they no longer had to retreat when cut off. They could hold their ground and be supplied from above. The jungle, once a prison, became defensible terrain. Then came a radical experiment. Brigadier Ord Wingate organized long-range penetration groups known as the Chindits. Operating deep behind Japanese lines, they were supplied entirely by air and tasked with disrupting communications. Militarily, their impact was limited. Casualties were high, the jungle proved merciless. But psychologically, the effect was electric. Here were Allied soldiers living, moving, and fighting in terrain once thought to belong exclusively to Japan. For the first time since 1942, Allied troops in Burma believed they could survive and strike back. Disease control improved. Malaria rates dropped, training intensified. Artillery coordination sharpened. Units learned to hold defensive boxes all around perimeters supported by air supply and concentrated firepower. Japanese infiltration, once devastating, began to lose its shock value. By 1943, the 14th Army was no longer an exhausted remnant. It was a hardened, adaptive force, but Japan was watching. Facing mounting pressure across the Pacific and economic strangulation at sea, Japanese command sought a decisive blow in Burma. If they could invade India, capture Imphal, and sever the rail link at Dimapur near Kohima, they might destabilize British rule and reverse momentum in Asia. The plan was audacious. It would require pushing through jungle and mountain passes into India itself, and in early 1944, they began to move. This time, however, they would not face the broken army of 1942, they would face Slim's reformed 14th Army, supplied by air, trained for jungle warfare, and psychologically prepared to be surrounded without surrendering. If you value deep, immersive explorations of history like this, stories that reveal how leadership and belief can reshape the outcome of war, make sure you subscribe and like this video. It helps others discover the powerful lessons hidden within these forgotten campaigns, because the test of reform was coming. And on the hills of Imphal and Kohima, the jungle would decide whether redemption was possible or whether Burma's tragedy would repeat itself in blood. By early 1944, the war in Asia had reached a decisive phase. Japan's empire, stretched across the Pacific, was under increasing pressure. Submarine blockades strangled shipping. American forces advanced island by island. In Tokyo, military planners concluded that only a bold, crushing offensive could reverse the tide. Their answer was Operation Yugo, an invasion of India through Burma. If Japanese forces could capture Imphal, sever the road to Dimapur at Kohima, and ignite unrest within British India, they might shatter Allied momentum in one audacious stroke. And if India destabilized, the consequences for the British Empire would be catastrophic. In March 1944, Japanese divisions crossed the Chindwin River and pushed westward into the hills. Their objective: encircle and destroy Allied forces at Imphal while cutting reinforcement routes at Kohima. The terrain was brutal: steep ridges, narrow tracks, and jungle that swallowed entire battalions. But Japanese command believed speed and surprise would replicate the triumphs of 1942. At first, the advance seemed unstoppable. Imphal was encircled, supply roads were cut. Japanese artillery rained shells onto defensive positions. For a moment, history threatened to repeat itself. Another Allied force trapped in jungle terrain, another spiral toward collapse. Yet something was different. The 14th Army did not panic. Defensive boxes were formed, units dug in, creating all-around perimeters. And from the sky, transport aircraft roared overhead, dropping food, ammunition, and reinforcements directly into the besieged garrison. Encirclement no longer meant defeat. Meanwhile, to the north, Kohima became the epicenter of a struggle that would define the campaign. A small garrison of roughly 1,500 defenders held a ridge overlooking the vital road to Dimapur. They faced nearly 15,000 Japanese troops determined to break through. Fighting erupted around the district commissioner's bungalow. Trenches were dug so close that opposing soldiers were separated by the width of a tennis court. Grenades arced back and forth across that narrow strip of earth. Snipers watched for the slightest movement. It was intimate, brutal, relentless. Water ran short, casualties mounted. The defenders clung to their hilltop position with diminishing numbers. At one point, Japanese troops overran sections of the perimeter, and hand-to-hand combat erupted in the shattered gardens. For days, neither side yielded, and had Kohima fallen entirely, the road to the Brahmaputra Valley, and perhaps deeper into India, would have lain open. But reinforcements arrived. Slim's strategy of air supply proved decisive. Imphal's defenders, sustained by constant aerial drops, held firm. Japanese forces, by contrast, had extended their supply lines to breaking point. Monsoon rains returned, food dwindled, disease spread among Japanese ranks. Their doctrine demanded relentless assault, often at suicidal cost. Soldiers charged fortified positions with bayonets and grenades, urged forward by a culture that equated surrender with dishonor. Yet this was no longer 1942. The 14th Army had been reforged. Artillery coordination was precise, defensive boxes held. Air superiority allowed Allied forces to strike supply routes and reinforce critical positions. What began as encirclement transformed into a trap, but this time for the attackers. Japanese divisions, cut off and starving, began to disintegrate under sustained counterattack. By July 1944, the offensive had collapsed. At Imphal and Kohima, Japanese forces suffered catastrophic losses, tens of thousands killed, wounded, or lost to starvation and disease. It was the first time in the Burma campaign that a major Japanese offensive had not merely stalled, but shattered. Historians would later call it the Stalingrad of the East. The myth of Japanese invincibility in jungle warfare was broken. The road into India remained closed, and from that moment forward, the strategic momentum in Burma shifted irreversibly. The army that had retreated in humiliation 2 years earlier now advanced with confidence. The psychological transformation was complete. Reform had not only restored capability, it had restored belief. From the ashes of the sitting disaster to the blood-soaked tennis court at Kohima, the Burma campaign had traced a journey from collapse to redemption. The forgotten war had found its turning point.